Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review, the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking. I'm Kate, and as we head into cherry blossom season, our reading takes us east with the novel Mild Vertigo by Japanese author Mieko Kanai. In a nutshell, the book has been described as a stream of consciousness novel that tackles the existential traps of motherhood, marriage and domestic captivity. It's also written in single sentences that go on for pages with hardly any paragraph breaks. As readers, we love a sentence, but can we cope when they go on for pages and pages? Find out what our podcast book club made of it. Joining me are two guests, both of whom have significant connections to Japan. Yuki Tejima is a writer and translator who delights thousands of followers with her Instagram account @BookNerdTokyo, showcasing the delights of Tokyo's bookshops. She's currently hard at work translating a novel by Mizuki Tsujimura titled Lost Souls Meet Under a Full Moon, due to be published by Penguin in early 2025. My second guest, Shawn Mooney, hosts a popular booktube channel under the name Shawn the Book Maniac. He's a self-described Saskatchewan-based queer Canadian booktuber maniac who moved back home after 13 years in Tokyo in the spring of 2022. Stay tuned for their thoughts on Mild Vertigo, their current reads, and our book recommendations for anyone wanting the inside track on great Japanese fiction. All that coming up here on the Book Club Review. Yuki, Shawn, it's wonderful to have you both with me.
So great to be here. I would assess my vertigo level as moderately high to be on your podcast, Kate.
Shawn's enjoying the early evening in Saskatoon. I'm the night owl here in London, and Yuki heroically offered to take the early morning shift in Tokyo. To be on 3 continents and to be able to connect in this way is a wonderful thing, I was thinking. We're often a bit wary sometimes of technology and the way that it's taking over everything in our lives, but at the same time I was noticing that fact that we're able to do this and how extraordinary that is. Anyway, welcome to both of you.
I'm so excited to be here. And Kate, I think your late night shift is just as hard. So thank you for this.
Tell us a little bit more about yourself. You were born in Tokyo, but you grew up in LA, is that right?
That's right. I was born in Tokyo, moved early. I was 4 years old when I moved to Los Angeles and grew up there. I hadn't been back to live in Tokyo until very recently, actually. I've been in Tokyo for about 10 years now, but it's taken me this long to come back. It feels like a completely, not foreign because I have visited as a child with family, but living here is a whole different thing. Every day is a new adventure. And I think my way of getting to know a city is to go to all the bookstores. And that's how my account, Book Nerd Tokyo, started. I just wanted to show everyone all these wonderful independent bookstores that were in Tokyo.
Are you completely bilingual? Were you brought up speaking Japanese as well as English?
My parents are Japanese. They're both from Tokyo. So we did speak Japanese in the house, but that got harder as my brothers and I started speaking in English to each other because going to American school, our friends were all speaking English and that just became easier. So speaking in Japanese gradually became more of a burden. We had to go to Japanese school on top of our regular school. And so I think I really do respect the way that my parents were. That was the one thing that they were very adamant about. Speak Japanese at home. You know, you are not allowed to quit Japanese school. You will thank us one day. And they really were right.
And when you read, do you tend to read in English or do you prefer to read in Japanese, or are you completely comfortable switching between the two? What's your reading language of choice?
I do read in both. I usually have 2 books going, one in Japanese and one in English, not related to each other, but my mind wants to be in one language at certain times of the day and the other language at other times of the day. And also I spend a lot of time at home. I still consider the States home. So when I'm at my parents' house or with my family, I want to read all of the English books that I can get my hands on. I go to the library, go to the bookstore, and I'm reading English books. I forget that Japanese books even exist. But then when I come back to Tokyo and I go to the bookstore and I see all these new books that have just come out, all of a sudden I have this hunger for Japanese books that had been laying dormant. So I do wildly go from one end to the other and obsessively read in both.
And before we move on to Shawn, I'd love to know, what are you reading right now?
Right now, I'm reading, this is the Japanese version of a book that's coming out at the end of February. The English book is called A Woman of Leisure by Kyoko Murata, and it's translated by the wonderful Juliet Winters Carpenter. This is the Japanese version. It's called Yūko. I'm only just getting started, so I don't know how it is, but I'm very excited.
I can't wait to come back to you and talk some more about the differences in reading both languages, but let's move on to Shawn. Shawn, I feel I know very well those bookshelves that I can see behind you because they're the regular feature on your YouTube channel. But tell us a little bit more about yourself and your connection with Japan.
I was born and raised in Saskatchewan, and I've lived all across Canada. And I became an ESL teacher in the mid-2000s. And that's what got me to Japan. I was interested in Japanese culture and Japanese food and history. And then I made a visit, my first visit to Japan, and I was hooked on the culture and everything. I made another visit or two before I moved there to teach English, and that's what I did when I was there for 13 years. But that's all kind of the ostensible reasons. If I had a beer, I'd probably tell you the reason I moved to Japan was for the men. I just am obsessed, or certainly was for many years. I still am to a little bit more mature degree with Japanese men. So yeah, I had a good time. And I came home with a husband. So there you go.
So you're now married to a Japanese man?
I am. He's not here. We're still waiting on his immigration stuff to be finalized, but he'll be joining me here any month now.
And what's your degree of fluency in Japanese, and do you read in Japanese?
I don't read in Japanese, and I would assess my own fluency as Boku no Nihongo wa hetakuso desu, which basically translates to my Japanese is really crappy. I hope that's not too strong a word for your podcast, Kate. But I studied conversational Japanese for about 2 or 3 years, and that enabled me to get through my daily life using Japanese and to have a date in Japanese and go shopping and so on. As an English teacher, everybody wants to talk English to you, even your friends after hours, and my husband. So anytime I try to talk Japanese to Kenji, every time he would say, "Oh, your Japanese is so cute," but he would never answer in Japanese. I feel very lucky that I've been back here coming up to 2 years back in Canada, and I haven't lost what little Nihongo I had. I'm still teaching my Japanese students on Zoom from here, and so I've kept it.
And you, I know, are a prolific reader. You often have many books on the go at once. What's just one that you're reading right now?
I just finished a Mexican novel called Home Reading Service by Fabia Morabito. It's translated from the Spanish by Curtis Bauer. 2018 publication in Mexico, and then a couple of years later in English. And this is fascinating for anybody who's into reading because it's a novel about reading. It's about a 35-year-old Mexican man who has a car accident for which he was at fault. And so his punishment is community service, reading to shut-ins, reading to the elderly and disabled in their homes. And he gets criticized by the people he reads to because they say, "You have a beautiful reading voice, but we can tell you're not paying attention to what you're reading. And the reading is not satisfying to us because we can tell you're just not really into it." And from that premise, the story gets wacky and absurd in a way that just mesmerized me. It was absolutely fascinating.
Let's turn to Mild Vertigo. We would usually start with a clip from the audiobook, but actually no audiobook seems to have been made yet, which I was thinking is a shame because it feels to me a book that would work really well on audio. It's narrated by a character called Natsumi, and it's her internal train of thought about her everyday life as a housewife in Tokyo. She has a husband, she has 2 children, and she spends her days doing housework, shopping in the supermarket, cooking. She occasionally meets neighbours, she's in touch with her parents, and occasionally she connects with her old school friends. But the main thing you sense about her is that she feels a certain dissatisfaction, a certain sort of disconnection with her life. And it seemed to me that the novel is about her attempts to understand those feelings and her place in the world. I wanted to read a passage from quite early on, and I thought actually what I really wanted to do was wanted to hear how it sounded in Japanese. So I'm going to ask Yuki to read this little passage, which is from quite early on, where Natsumi is doing the washing up and she finds herself transfixed by the water coming out of the tap. So Yuki will read the Japanese, and then I will pick up and I will read you the English, and I'll carry on a little bit just so you get a bit more of a sense of the style of the book.
I'm happy to do it. I'm actually only reading 2 sentences, but it's going to go on for a little bit because each sentence is very long. Here I go. それから朝食の汚れた食器を洗おうとして、放浪のシンクの前に立ち、白いプラスチックの洗い桶に入ったバターとサラダの油を浮かべた水の中の食器を取り上げ、洗剤で洗ってたら、流しっぱなしの水道の水で洗剤の泡を流していると、手は食器を持ったまま、じっと水の流れるのを見つめている自分に気がつく。窓から差し込む午前中の光が蛇口から流れる水の紐をキラキラきらめかせ、シンクで飛沫を跳ね散らかせながら排水口に吸い込まれ、水は休みなく流れ続け、想像しいというほどではないのだけれども、水道管の中を通る水と空気が管に響くようなかすかな反響を立て、プラスチックの洗い桶の縁から溢れて、小さなちょろちょろという軽い音を立て続ける。
After that, she's standing in front of the enamel sink, washing the dirty breakfast dishes, picking the plates out of the plastic tub of water with blobs of butter and cooking oil floating on the surface, and soaping them with washing up liquid. And it's as she's rinsing off the washing up liquid under the tap that she finds herself there, a plate held in her hand, staring fixedly at the running water. The rays of morning light pouring in through the window make the rope of water streaming from the tap twinkle and sparkle, and the water sends spray sputtering about the sink as it's sucked down into the drain, flowing continuously, ceaselessly, not exactly noisily, but creating a slight reverberation as the water and the air echo through the pipes, and the water spills over the rim of the plastic tub, making a faint trickling noise. It's not a big deal or anything, but do you ever find that happening to you? I guess you don't do the dishes very often, but what if you're brushing your teeth, say? Do you not ever just find yourself staring at the water as it rushes down the drain? And it's strangely pleasant, that feeling. Of course, it's no big deal, but you kind of zone out, as if you're dreaming, though it's not any dream in particular that you're having. And then you come back to yourself with a jolt as you realise that you're wasting water. I guess you just wouldn't understand it as a man, especially one who so rarely does any form of housework, Natsumi said to her husband, and her husband raised his eyebrows in a way that suggested both slight irritation and a modicum of concern, making a face that meant, "What are you trying to say exactly?" I was very interested, as I listened to you reading, Yuki, in the difference between the sound of the Japanese and then almost listening to myself as I was reading it and my consciousness of the way that my voice was going up and down. The more I thought about the original Japanese writing, the degree to which reading this in English is different. And so I was so interested to talk to both of you who have a stronger sense than I do of that original work and her voice in its pure form. What were your feelings about the book when you read it? Yuki, should we start with you?
This was my first time reading Mieko Kanai, even though she's legendary in Japan, and she has 30 novels and short stories to her name and more essays, and she writes in magazines and publications. And so it was intimidating where to start because she's written so much in Japanese. I had no idea where to start. But when I heard that Polly Barton was going to be translating a Mieko Kanai, I thought, oh, that's my entry because I will read anything that Polly translates. And I know that I'm in great hands. So I started reading the English and I didn't know about the structure. I didn't know the sentences were so long. So I started reading and I was reading and I was reading. And minutes later, I was still reading the first sentence, 4 pages in. And I was thinking, my goodness, Polly Barton, this is amazing. My reaction hearing you read, Kate, I thought, wow, it just sounds like Mieko Kanai just switched over suddenly into a different language. And she's just speaking in the same kind of tone and the same pace, being able to read in Japanese and then hearing the English. It sounded like she was still speaking in the same language to me. That was fascinating to hear.
Shawn, how about you?
I was surprised by how much I loved this. I thought I was going to be intimidated by it, but I found it actually accessible. I found the long sentences an absolute delight. They didn't give me a headache. I can think of other writers where I couldn't finish the book, the famous one being Duck's Newber Report. That was an utter failure for me, although I will give it another try. Whereas this, I just fell into the sentences, and I think we're probably going to be talking about the image that was at the heart of the reading, about the tap water running, but I found the sentences flowed like that for me and created a very fluid texture of memory and emotion and irritation and social commentary was just incredible. What I don't know is whether I will remember anything about this book in 6 months. I'm not sure how much of it's going to stick with me, but boy, it was a wild ride.
Yeah, thinking about these sentences, there are no paragraph breaks. You don't get a rest. I had read about it and I thought, not sure. And I went to the bookshop and I picked it up in the bookshop and I stood there and I read a few pages from the first chapter. And what you realize straight away is it's not hard to read. In fact, it's very easy to read. And the reason it's easy to read is because it feels like thought. One of the pleasures of the book for me was that it felt like the process of thought was being really beautifully articulated in a way that you're not used to seeing or experiencing. We think the way we think, but it's unusual to see that captured, I thought, so effectively on the page. And after a while, it's almost like when you're not reading the book, you have a heightened awareness of your own thoughts. The book works on you at the same time as you're reading the book. One interesting thing that came up in the book club is the question, is it a horror story?
I don't think so. Homemaking and house cleaning is horrifying. That's why I never do it.
But this character, it doesn't feel like she really has a choice about that, even though no one is forcing her physically to do these things. But at the same time, you have a very strong sense that she feels obligated to do all these things. And not only that, but to do them to a certain standard, to perform this role. And that somehow is she trapped within that. But at the same time, I think there is a real ambiguity there. I hadn't read it that way. I felt like she has her frustrations, but at the same time, I saw contentment there. I didn't feel it was a horror story to me.
She feels the cultural expectation, but she never meets it. She doesn't keep the cleanest house. I think that's why I liked her so much.
Horror might be a strong word because she writes in the afterword in the Japanese that she really is a fan of the non-dramatic. She does not like to create drama. She says that I'm so drawn to the non-dramatic. Karui memai, which is the Japanese title. Karui memai, it translates obviously to mild vertigo, but it's a light dizziness. Karui means it's a light dizziness. So just in everyday life, you go around and sometimes you just feel a little dizzy, but it's mild because it's just there. It exists. It's not a dramatic event. She lives with it. She goes with it. And that might feel in a way, I think she's saying that there is something horrific about that, in that we're all lightly dizzy at all times. But this is not just because Natsumi is a housewife. It's the fact that she'll go to a friend's house and it's the fact that her friends don't seem to notice what their lives have become. I feel like the horror for her is in not noticing the state of your life, going through life without really thinking about it or noticing anything. I came out of this, like you were saying, Kate, I came out of this wanting to just go immediately to my journal and write down every single thing that's happened in my day. But then do I think about my life being a horror show? Not really. But yes, there are things that I don't want to do in my day. Definitely it's back and forth in my mind.
And I would like to circle back to Kate and I feeling that there was a sense of contentment here. And so the mild vertigo or dizziness, that describes to a T the effect her writing had on me. Those looping sentences that went back to memory and back to the present and all this almost sociological description, they did make me a little bit lightheaded. Moments of beauty, but not just that, just moments of wonderment about the quotidian, the banal.
She's quite disconnected. She has 2 children, but she doesn't exhibit particularly strong maternal feelings towards them. And indeed, she's quite pleased when she gets the opportunity to pack them off to the grandparents for an extended stay so that she's going to get some time to herself. I mean, you know, I'm a mother. I can relate. Like, I'd be delighted if a grandparent offered to take my children off my hands for a few weeks. My instinctive reaction to that was, I know how she feels. But others in the book club were surprised at the extent to which she seemed quite detached, and also from her husband to a certain degree. It sort of starts to make you ask questions. Psychologically, is there something going on here? Is there a reason why she's withdrawing in this way? And I feel like the novel plays with that. The other example was her connections with her friends, where it's almost like her female friends and people she encounters in the community are offering different models of how to be. So there is her friend who remained single, is an architect, feels like almost quite aspirational model of womanhood. She's very independent, she's successful, she's feisty and interesting and culturally very connected. And you see Natsumi sort of assessing all this. but at the same time, it doesn't move her to make any changes in her own life. She doesn't do anything with the information. What do you think? She seems strangely passive.
In Japanese culture, there's a honne to tatemae. These two are often spoken about in a set. Honne is how you really feel inside. It's your truth. It's what you feel. Tatemae is the face that you've put forward when you're seeing anybody. When you're speaking to people, you have your tatemae, which is your presentation. This is how you're presenting yourself. And this honne to tatemae happens all day long in Japanese life. You rarely are in your honne state, unless you're maybe by yourself, you're writing in your journal. If you're doing any kind of creative work, maybe you're experiencing moments of honne, your truth, as you do that creation. But most of the time, whether you're going to the supermarket or whether you're just on a train, reading quietly when you want to not be there, you want to go outside and run and scream because the trains are driving you crazy. Public life in Japan is all about tatemae most of the time. It's how people perceive you. It's how you want people to perceive you. It's how you present. And so I feel this book is all honne because we get to hear her internal dialogue. So this is her honne, her truth, but the truth that only she knows and only we as readers know, and we're allowed into her honne, but everybody else in the book sees her tatemae, I think, even her family to some extent, because she's not telling them her truth. But the truth is coming out in her attitude towards them, I think. So she might not say it in so many words as we might in English. We might say, "You're really annoying me right now. Will you please leave me alone?" But in Japanese, you don't say that. You might, obviously, families do. But if you're comparing between an English-speaking household and a Japanese-speaking one, a lot more is just read. You just read the room and you do what you feel is appropriate in that moment.
KY.
And so it exactly, KY, kuki yomenai, which means you can't read the room. So if someone, they used to say this kind of slang, "Oh, that person's so KY," would mean that he or she can't read the room. They have no sense of what's going on around them and they'll say something appropriate. So that's the thing. People tend to judge you if you can't read the room, if you don't get a sense for what people are thinking. And so when I first got to Japan, I am Japanese. I grew up in a Japanese family, but I did not know what these people were thinking. So all day long, you're thinking about the appropriate thing to do. And that's why I think this book, it's full of non-appropriate thoughts, but it's her honne, it's her truth. And that's why I think I appreciated it so much.
I think that's spot on. I hadn't thought of it as I was reading, but now I'm running the whole novel through my brain again with that in mind. Absolutely. And I also thought that one moment where her husband showed his truth, his honne, was when he came home drunk and said, "You're not going to leave me, are you?" And then alcohol in Japanese culture is fascinating in that way.
Absolutely. A lot of the times, drinking and getting drunk is the only way to allow people to hear your honne and to hear other people's honne. So even in work settings, people go out and they drink because in the office, they're not able to communicate in a way that they might be able to after a couple of drinks. So I think that alcohol is definitely a part of the culture here because people need a ticket. They need 2 drinks, 3 drinks to be able to say, "Here's how I really feel about this situation."
They actually have a hybrid English-Japanese word for that in a business setting. Going out after work for drinks is nomunication. Nomu means drink and nomunication. It's a very important part of Japanese business life.
Communicating through drinking, yes.
I mean, we have that here in the UK, but I don't think we don't really have a name for it. I'm curious to know then, is there a sense that this is quite a radical novel in a way? Would it be unusual to have a woman's thoughts expressed like this on the page? And the other thing to note, which we talked about quite early on in the book club, is the fact that this book was published in 1997. So there is a considerable time lag from when this book was originally written to now. For us, it seems fresh and new and exciting. But of course, this is a book that's been around a while. And I'm guessing that the conversation about women's writing, feminism in Japan has moved on in the same way it has in other countries. But I'm curious to know, Yuki, how you feel this book fits in with writing by women in Japan and Japanese feminism
I'm definitely not an expert on Kanai Mieko Kanai. We had this discussion about whether to call her Kanai Mieko or Mieko Kanai. In Japanese, you say the last name first, so it's Kanai Mieko. I'm used to, in English-speaking context, saying Mieko Kanai, the first name first, but I might go back and forth. But I think in Kanai's case, this writing is not radical for her. She's very vocal. She writes a lot of essays as well. And she doesn't mince words. She has never been thought of, I don't think, as a reserved type of writer or communicator. So I don't think this is surprising for her. I think it's incredible that something written in 1997 is translated in 2023 and is just as powerful and feels timely. But I don't think that this is radical in that nobody has written in this way, especially when it comes to Tokyo housewives. There are a lot of novels in Japan centered around the honne, the truth of the Tokyo housewife. And it usually is not what the media, it's the opposite of what in the media. And that's why you get these novels, because the media and society doesn't oftentimes give housewives the credit that they deserve. So amongst each other, among the housewives, this is nothing surprising. Everyone just relates. And oh, of course, why would anyone question this at all? This is obvious, duh. But to somebody who is not in that world, this might come as a shock, as surprising that, oh, wow, these women have thoughts, these women have things that they're not happy about. I wouldn't call it a genre, but there are a lot of novels about housewives and the truth about being a housewife and how there's not even just one definition, though society seems to think that there is.
I would just add very briefly that I think that the status of women in Japanese society is decades and decades behind the West. And Yuki, feel free to correct me, but I was shocked. And the status of human rights and women around childcare and around employment and the kinds of humiliating job interviews women have, young women have. Why should I hire you? You're just going to get pregnant and leave. Like, it's unbelievable. So yeah, Japan has a lot of catching up to do, or a lot of its own evolution to do around these issues, gender and feminism.
And I do think a lot of women are becoming more and more vocal now, and Mieko Kanai has definitely inspired, I would say, a generation of women. A lot of my reading in Japanese literature is self-taught and self-driven, so I naturally gravitate towards novels by women, contemporary women writers. And the more I read them, the more I see that these people look up to writers like Mieko Kanai, and they grew up reading Mieko Kanai. And so you can see how Kanai has inspired generations of younger women writers.
There's one section I would be curious to know both of your responses to. Towards the end of the book, we suddenly have two essays that are on two different photographers, Araki, whose work I was more familiar with, and
Hineo Kuwabara.
Right, whose work I didn't know, but then I looked him up and it felt like his work was much more Japanese people doing everyday things, quite a warm, almost affectionate look at Japanese people going about ordinary lives and capturing all these little intimate moments as if unobserved. Whereas Araki, I felt, has a much more performative style, and also someone who it feels like the photographer himself is really making strong statements with his work. I mean, this feels like the most basic possible overview. I'm not really familiar with either of their work, but the problem for the reader is that these essays have a significant portion of the book. The narrator, Natsumi, is given the catalogue to these exhibitions by her friend, and she reads it. And as I understand it, these were essays that Mieko Kanai had already written elsewhere, and so she placed them here in the book. But I have to say, as a group, collectively, we found them difficult because they're more difficult in tone than the rest of the book because they're just more complicated. They're harder to understand, and I think culturally they're much harder for us to pass. But also, one of the book clubbers, Pauline, said she really felt that the entire point of the book was somehow contained within these essays, and that it was something to do with this way of looking at the world, or this difference in the way of looking at the world, that was what the novel was all about. I wasn't able to get to that clarity myself. I'm curious to know how you responded to those sections. Shawn, should we start with you?
Sure, because I'll be very brief. I didn't make a very eloquent connection either, but I did think there was something about the fact that Kuwabara was a street photographer. So he was basically just taking pretty candid shots of people, whereas the Araki photographs were very stylized, very shaped. It was his vision. He was putting people in positions, posing them for his photographs. And I thought there's something there about what is found and photographed that roughly cues to her writing style, the way that it's what is found in this protagonist's consciousness without the hane, that is unedited and unfiltered, and it's what is what you get. But I couldn't get any farther than that. So we'll let Yuki take over and deepen or tell us what it was really meant.
Oh no, those sections definitely they were harder to follow. And you're right, Kate. I did read in the afterword in every Japanese book or almost every Japanese novel, there's always an afterword, atogaki, afterword, usually by the author. And in the atogaki, the afterword of this novel, she specifically states that those essays were written for when Kineo Kuwabara had a photo exhibition in 1995. They usually have these catalogs for the photo exhibition. And those two essays were written for that. They were published there first. But at the same time, she said she wrote them with the intention of including them in a novel that would become Karui Memae. It would become Mild Vertigo. So she did write it with this novel in mind. I don't know how much of the novel had already been written at this time, but she had been intending to include it. What I thought was interesting was that it made me think about the audience. The audience, when she writes for a photography exhibit, which is not even an exhibition of her own, she's writing about a different artist. The audience she has in mind for that exhibit versus the audience that she has in mind for Mild Vertigo, which in itself was a column, a series, a serialized novel in Kate Gaho, which is a very high-end women's magazine, and it still exists, and it's this thick, and it's so heavy, and you can't read it on the train because it uses such high-quality paper, and the photography is beautiful, and it's just this very high-end, classy magazine for women. Mild Vertigo was written as a serialized novel in that magazine, so that has a certain audience, women who may or may not be housewives, but they are interested in culture and art and craft and travel and food. And that's what this magazine is about. So she's writing a lot of Mild Vertigo for these women. She has this audience in mind. And then the photography catalog has a kind of a whole different audience. Bringing these two together, I think the voice is going to differ, the tone. But I thought that was interesting in itself, that she writes for these different audiences, but she has something to say for each audience. And to think of Mild Vertigo as something that was written in the late 90s for these women who can read these high-end magazines, what was the message that she was trying to get across there versus this photography exhibition. And so in that way, it was interesting for me to learn that context because it gave me an idea of the different types of writing that she does for different audiences. I don't know if that deepens it, but for me, it gave me a better understanding of why they sounded so different on the page.
In the section about Kuwabara, she writes, the title given to Kuwabara's most recent photo exhibition, Afternoon Smiles, 1992, refers to the smiles of reconfirming, in the ethics of the finger and the gaze, a world, be that of Tokyo or Tokyo, that is not flattened by being accommodated within the frame, which flows over with the dynamism of time and life, and truly continues to expand. By sharing Kuwabara's smiles, we can find the conviction to live in this world. And it seemed like there was something there about art, about somehow looking beyond oneself, about somehow in the connections with others. And then perhaps that feeds into my sense from talking to you and other things I've read is such a strong sense of collective society in Japan and one's place as an individual within that, which I think is very, very different and very alien to English readers. There's something there. We didn't get an afterword, unfortunately, by the author, so that was not translated. It's interesting to me that it exists, but it wasn't included in the Fitzcarraldo edition. Interestingly, the American edition, which is published by New Directions, did have an afterword. Yes, Yuki is holding up the beautiful cover of a sort of a woman's shirt, and it has flowers coming out of it, and the type is very slightly distorted. It's all very subtle and beautiful. But we didn't get that in the UK. We have our very minimalist Fitzcarraldo, which I think the very interesting idea behind Fitzcarraldo books is that there is no cover image. The only clue you are going to get to what this text is about is to read the text. You're not going to get influenced by a cover image that's been imposed on it, which in itself is a really interesting thing, but particularly interesting in light of this book where we just had nothing to go on. All we had was the words that we read. But the afterword in the New Directions edition is by an author called Kate Zambrino. I did find it online, and obviously you have it in your edition. Some of us were able to read it. And that was curious because she was writing about the difficulty of writing this article on Mild Vertigo and approaching Kanai Mieko's work. But at the same time, she was finding it impossible to carve out the space within her everyday life, which was busy, and she had family commitments and lots of things going on, as we all do. And the whole article was basically about that. So when I read that, I was sort of like, oh, is that what the book was about then? Was it about somehow failing to write a novel because you're just living and the everyday busy work of living gets in the way?
That's fascinating. I love that. I love that idea. So in this version, in the New Directions version, the afterword begins, but it doesn't say Kate Zambrano. It doesn't have her name on the page of the afterword begins. I finished reading the novel and I was reading and it's the afterword and it says on the cover that afterword by Kate Zambrano. So I should have known, but I just kept reading and I was reading and I thought that this was Kanai still writing. And even if names like Sophia came up and the Strand in New York and things like that, I still felt Kanai is so experimental. She can write about basically anything. Maybe she went to New York for this bit. Maybe she's a cultural critic. She has so many cultural references. So I read maybe 2 or 3 pages until the word Instagram came on the page. Then that was the first I thought, wait, Instagram, that's weird. So then I went back and I realized finally that Kate Zambrano had been writing this. And the reason why I couldn't make that connection is because the writing was so similar. She wrote in the style of Mieko Kanai in this stream of consciousness way. And so I so enjoyed the afterword. I thought it was wonderful. And for me, if anything about the Kanai part was foreign in terms of context and just I didn't get the cultural references, once we switched to the English, the American context, it made so much more sense to me. And I was able to make so much more sense of the Kanai novel through the afterword, thinking that, okay, maybe there's a universal quality to Kanai's writing, what she's writing about, because you change the country, you change the context, but you write in the same style and it's very universal, it connects. And it made me feel that maybe the Japanese housewife experience is not as foreign or particular to Japan as I had thought.
Well, so many things, from the cleverness of its structure, the way what happens at the end is a certain amount of repetition comes back in, and this idea of the endless circularity of her days. It would be interesting if you were to look at it almost with this lens of how dark is this book? Is there horror in there? There are definitely elements that you could pull out where you could say, yes, actually, this is terrifying or this is threatening. It's all expressed so lightly and almost in a very even tone. But nonetheless, I think if you look for it, that darkness is there. At the same time as humour. It didn't ever make me laugh out loud, but there were definitely many moments where it made me smile. And I loved it for that. And it made for fantastic discussion. I could sit here and talk to you both easily for another hour, I'm sure. But I would love to come on to your own recommendations for other things people might like to try, some follow-on reads from Mild Vertigo. Before we get to our book recommendations, let me just take a moment to tell you about some of the ways you can support us here at the Book Club Review. One is completely free, and that is to rate and review the show, which helps other people find it. But wait, there's more. If you'd like a weekly email from me full of book recommendations to help you figure out what you would enjoy reading next, access to our podcast spreadsheets, and the opportunity to connect with other listeners and share thoughts on books via our chat group, then you can sign up to our Patreon. At the higher tier, you can become a member of our monthly book club, which meets via Zoom. And if you can't make the sessions in person, you can watch the recording anytime. Check the link in the show notes or go to patreon.com/The Book Club Review for the different membership tiers and benefits, and the details of book club reads coming up. And to our wonderful community of Patreons currently supporting the show, as ever, a huge thank you. Shawn, shall we start with you?
Sure. One of my favorite writers, not just Japanese writers, but favorite writers in the world, is Yūko Tejima. And her most recently translated novel is Woman Running in the Mountains, which came out from NYRB either late 2021 or early 2022. And it was originally published in Japanese in 1980. And her earlier novellas I loved too, Territory of Light and Child of Fortune. And this one I loved even more. And it is about a 20-year-old Japanese woman who becomes pregnant as a single woman with a very brief affair with a married man. And she's living at home with a violently alcoholic father and a wacko mother and an indifferent brother, and decides to keep the baby. And the parents pressure her to get an abortion. She adamantly refuses to get an abortion. And that, to be a single mother, especially in that time, was scandalous. The thing that made me think of Mild Vertigo, or that made me think of Woman Running in the Mountains while I read Mild Vertigo, is this protagonist's the way that imagination, where she goes off into the mountains in her mind, and that is a place of serenity or a way that she calms herself down, contrasting that with the vertigo-inducing flights of fancy that our protagonist here does. This was just amazing. It's translated from the Japanese by Geraldine Harcourt, and I absolutely loved it. So that is one.
And I saw when you held the cover up briefly that the foreword is by Lauren Groff, which also would catch my attention. Anything that Lauren Groff liked, I feel sure would be good.
I have one by a man. I don't like to read very many male writers, but this one was pretty darn good. I read it late last year, and it is a book that was published in Japanese in 1966, and the translation, I believe, is 2002. Grass for My Pillow by Saichi Maruya, translated from the Japanese by Dennis Bean. And this is a novel about a draft dodger, although the term doesn't quite apply during the Pacific War in Japan, but he was a Japanese man who resisted going into the army, and so he was on the run for the entire war, hiding out, evading military conscription. And it's about that experience. So it was a remarkable way to get a different perspective on what Japan was like during the war. We also see him in the 60s. He's a university administrator. And as the politics of Japan shifts, the 60s was a time of political fermentation and dissent, and his status as a draft evader becomes politically suspect in a way that it wasn't in the first 15 years after he re-entered society. In the 60s, people are becoming more suspicious of his past, and so it's those two storylines, and I found it absolutely fascinating.
Oh, I have never heard of either of those books or those authors, so thank you very much for flagging them up for me. Yuki, how about you?
This is one of my favorite novels. It's called The Little House by Kyoko Nakajima, and it's translated by the wonderful Jenny Tapley Takemori. And this is a wonderful novel because it made me think about, it gave me a little bit more context about why Japanese housewives, why so many expectations are put on them about keeping house and about cooking, and everyone should be able to keep a spotless house while cooking, while raising children, while doing crafts, while basically building a beautiful home, while maybe working on the side, maybe having a job. But to do all this, even in modern Japan, I don't know if you've seen the bentos that a lot of mothers make for their children every day, were these character bentos, these beautiful kind of basically animation in a bento box. So you open the bento box and it uses cartoon character. And these mothers who wake up at 5 a.m. to make these lunches for their children, and so many mothers in Japan, it's still a given that they do that. And I've wondered about, okay, where did that all come from? Why are housewives expected to do all of this? And if they can't do it perfectly, why do they feel pressured? Why do they feel like failures? Why do they feel like they're not living up to people's expectations? The Little House is wonderful because it is about a longtime maid. It's about a maid who worked for a middle-class family. Taki, she was a young girl when she started working for them, but she's now at the end of her life reflecting on her time with the family. And her time with the family was wonderful. She calls her the mistress, but the lady of the house, the woman of the house, was always kind to her. They had a young boy that she took care of. And it's a wonderful story. It's basically written as a diary of this woman at the end of her life, reflecting on her time in the 30s, working for this middle-class family, and through the war and what happened in World War II to the family and what happened with her afterwards. And it's very moving. But this Taki is wonderful around the house with what little resources as the war rages on, and even a well-to-do family has less and less. Taki is able to use what they have and cook up these beautiful meals. She just is so resourceful around the house, and she helps them continue to live a high quality life, even without the material things that we all think bring us happiness. And so because this novel is set before Kanai Mieko's book in the 90s, this is set in the 30s and pre-war and during the war. So it gives us an idea. It gave me a little context about Japan and the aspirations, why Japanese housewives aspire to be resourceful and to be able to whip up wonderful meals with just what they have in the fridge. There's just a little passage, if I can read it, where some guests have come over and Taki has whipped up a little meal for them. And it's just a short passage. It says, "While the guests enjoyed a drink with a couple of snacks of vegetables simmered in soy sauce and white bait boiled in sweetened soy sauce, I steamed some rice together with shellfish preserved in mirin, ginger, and soy, and cut up some sardines marinated overnight into bite-sized pieces, coating them in potato starch before deep frying them. Oh my, Taki, what fantastic ideas you have," the mistress said delightedly. "I had always been adept at making do with what we had." And so that gives us an idea of why Taki was such a wonderful part of the family, how she became a part of this family when her job was to housekeep and to cook and to clean for them. And it connected inside of me. This is a line, this is a tradition that Japanese housewives are expected to be able to do these things. But now in modern day, a lot of women, they know the expectations and they also aspire to some of those things, but they don't have the time and they don't have the resources and they don't have the need or the want to do those things. So this is a wonderful novel. And another one is a novel that's translated by Polly Barton, because I think that if you appreciated her translation in Mild Vertigo, you will definitely appreciate her translation in There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job by Kikuko Tsumura. And the connection there was that is about a woman who goes from part-time job to part-time job to part-time job because she's burnt out on work altogether, on trying to build a career, on all of society's expectations. So it's similar in that it's got this dry, cynical humor that I think, Kate, you were alluding to, where it's not laugh out loud, but it's like you can relate and you laugh, and it's dry, but it's got this wit because she's in this state where she's going from pointless job to pointless job. And the point for her is to find these pointless jobs where she doesn't have to use her brain, where she can just do these things without thinking about it. Basically, for me, Mild Vertigo, if that's in the house and in the mind of a housewife, There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job is more career-based, it's more workplace-based, but it's a similar kind of dull, numb, tedious, everyday buzz. There's a buzziness. There's a kind of a Mild Vertigo there in the workplace. And they're both translated by Polly, so you know you're in good hands. And I thought that kind of theme-wise and temperature-wise, they talk about temperature a lot in Japan, like your temperature about this movie or your temperature about this book. And I think temperature-wise, these two protagonists are this kind of similar temperature towards life.
I know about the temperature thing because I've just finished reading 50 Sounds by Polly Barton. Have you read it, Shawn?
No, but I'm aware of it. And I think I actually just got the audiobook through Spiracle.
Oh, I think it would be wonderful to listen to. That would be great. I wouldn't mind reading it again, actually, and listening to it the second time around. So Polly Barton, it's her memoir of when she first went to Japan, and her interest in Japan and then falling in love with the language and her desire to stay and really master the language and become not only verbally fluent, but I think culturally fluent as well. And almost the impossibility of that. That's what's contained within this book. You start to understand it's not really something that's possible to achieve. And it's very interesting to see where she ends up and almost her own reconciling those expectations with the reality of what she is able to achieve. But it's also structured around the mechanics of translation. Every section, and they're written in these short sections, 50 sounds, is an onomatopoeic Japanese word. Often they're two words together. Just opening it at random. Zara, Zara. I don't know how you pronounce it.
Zara.
Zara, Zara. The sound of the rough ground. How about Giza, Giza?
Giza, yep. Mm-hmm.
The sound of seeing what you thought was yours. Oh, hang on. I can't read that one out loud. Sometimes they're a bit X-rated because the other thing that happens in this novel is a love affair, a very, very powerful love affair she has with a man that she meets and where that takes her. Kira kira.
Kira kira.
The sound of a hashtag magic life or embracing your shining future. So these are things where there is no direct translation into English. There's no one easy word in English that sums up that. And so even in the very beginning of every section, you have something that makes you think. It's really interesting, considering these things that we don't really have words for, and then seeing how she weaves them into expressing her own story and taking you on this journey with her. And she weaves in philosophy. She's looking at Wittgenstein and his understanding of language and communication and some quite academic theories about that, but they're woven in very lightly in a way that I found very accessible and interesting to read. And I was really just blown away by how beautifully it's written, how much I enjoyed her voice, and really the extraordinary depth both of understanding it gave me, but also my profound sense of just how little I knew about Japan. And I've traveled to Japan a few times on holiday. Like you, Shawn, my husband and I went there and we both absolutely fell in love with it. And I think this is not uncommon. Many people do go there and are incredibly swept away. I just felt such a strong sense of how much I'd learned in reading this book and getting to see that journey that Polly Barton herself goes on. So I cannot recommend this highly enough. I thought it was an absolutely amazing book. And if you are enjoying reading Japanese literature or you're thinking about reading Japanese literature and you really want to get a real insight into what it is that you're reading, I think you couldn't do better than this book. It's wonderful. And it made me then want to read other books that she has translated. Someone in my book club has read other things that she's translated and described her as a bright translator. She said she felt that there was a brightness to everything that Polly Barton translates, which I thought was interesting as well, and getting a sense of her voice, which I didn't get from Mild Vertigo because I was getting Kanai Mieko's voice.
I agree. She's brilliant.
When you read something like that and you yourself are working as a translator, you must be wrestling with some of the same problems that she's encountering. Does that influence your own work? Were you able to learn things from that, or was there some kind of exchange when you're reading something like that?
Whenever I read anything Polly has written or translated, it basically makes me want to pack up and leave. She's just such a great writer and a brilliant translator that I feel Japanese literature is lucky to have her, to have somebody like her translating. And 50 Sounds, this is one of my go-tos. It's an inspiration. I love it. She's such a wonderful writer who makes observations about Japanese culture and the country that I can't, just because I can't see them anymore because it's too familiar. I think she is translating, she doesn't say, but she's translating the book that I just mentioned. There's no such thing as an easy job in this because there are passages about her having to find a certain translation for a certain passage. And when you know what book she's talking about, it's exciting. Reading her is inspiring, and I understand the translation bits, of course, wanting to translate a certain nuance and the difficulties of that. And especially she did it just with this 50 sounds, all these sounds that Japanese writers include in their novels, because it's just part of everyday conversation here, using words like pota pota and zaza for different types of rain. It's raining today, but okay, how would this rain be described? And a Japanese person would describe it a certain way. And then you would need to find an English equivalent because we don't have pota pota or zaza, shiku shiku or anything like that. So that's always the challenge. But yes, I agree wholeheartedly with your recommendation, Kate. 50 Sounds is brilliant. It's hard because I want Polly to write more in her own voice, but we also want her translations, as many as possible. And there's only one Polly Barton. So we just have to wait. And I know she's hard at work, but yeah, Anything that she writes or translates, I am there.
I see. She has
Well,
another book that was published somewhere last year and is coming out from Fitzgeraldo in April this year called Porn, an Oral History.
yes, that is out here in the UK. I was looking at it in the bookshop the other day and didn't really know what to make of it, so I put it back down. But now I've read 50 Sounds. I absolutely want to read Polly Barton's book about porn.
And she has a big translation coming out. It's called Butter by Asako Yuzuki. Butter was a mega bestseller in Japan, and it's going to be huge in English as well. I recommend Butter. I don't have the exact date, but I know it's coming out soon, spring 2024, maybe sooner. Definitely keep an eye out for that.
Well, thank you both so much. I have absolutely loved this conversation. It has been the greatest pleasure. Can I say arigatou gozaimasu?
Arigatou gozaimasu. Yes, thank you so much, Kate, for inviting me. I had a wonderful time.
Absolutely. On both of those. And my response to your arigatou gozaimasu is, kochira koso, it is me who should say so.
Exactly.
That's nearly it for this episode. You'll find links to all the books mentioned today in the show notes or at the episode page on our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk, where you'll also find an episode transcript. If you'd like to keep up with what I'm reading between shows, you'll find me on Instagram at Book Club Review Podcast, where each week on Sunday at around 10 p.m. UK time, you can also watch my live session where I'll tell you about 5 books I've been either reading or thinking about during the week. You'll also find me on Threads at The Book Club Review. If you haven't tried Threads, come and say hello. It's nice there. And if you have a yen to get more involved with the Book Club Review podcast, or just want to keep your distance but send some support my way, head over to patreon.com/The Book Club Review to find out the ways that you can do that. But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.